Welcome to Ed Circuit Author Chats, produced by MindRocket Media Group and presented by John Catt Educational. John Catt Educational is proud to feature a roster of authors that includes education experts and practitioners in the UK and North America. In this interview series, many of our authors will have the opportunity to discuss their latest publications and give you insights into the inspiration and strategies behind their books.
Our guest today on Ed Circuit Author Chats is Michael J. Petrilli. In collaboration with several other education leaders, Michael's newest book with John Catt Educational, Follow the Science to School, Evidence-Based Practices for Elementary Education, explores what science has to say about best educational practices in elementary classrooms. Mike Petrilli is president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, executive editor of Education Next, and a distinguished senior fellow for the Education Commission of the States. His work primarily focuses on effective strategies and the development of high-impact procedures. As an author and the executive editor for Education Next, Michael has worked to bring large theories and organizational development to the education politics sphere. His articles span the education world from early childhood education to higher education to policymaking. Michael, your new book uses a scientific approach to look at elementary education. What led you to that point of view?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show, Miss Bonnie, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. I feel a great amount of gratitude to John Catt, publishers, for putting this book out. So the background here is a couple of things. I have been thinking about a book like this or a project like this for many years. As we know, there is a growing research base around what works and when does it work, especially in the early years. We've, of course, had great research on early reading for many decades, but also when it comes to math, when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to lots of different facets of elementary schools. Arguably, we know more about how to do education right in those early years than we do for middle school and high school. And yet we also know that we forever have had a hard time getting educators access to this information in a way that might change practice. We've got the What Works Clearinghouse. We've had other initiatives to try to get this research into schools. But I, wondered if there was a way to do this, in some more user-friendly ways that might be more successful. And then COVID hit and the horrible pandemic. And of course, like everyone, we at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute were very interested in helping schools figure out how to address the massive learning loss that had happened. And so we put those ideas together and we ended up developing something that we ended up calling the Acceleration Imperative. And what that was basically a crowdsourced website with evidence-based ideas on how to help kids catch up from the pandemic, which really was largely the main message was to run a great school, right? Is that what kids were going to need, especially in the elementary grades, were all those scientifically based, evidence-based practices. And so that project, we ended up getting about 100 practitioners and scholars, academics, others to help us edit some initial drafts, give input, add new ideas. That was put out on the web for everybody. And then that really ended up turning into this book, Follow the Science to School, which is kind of the book version of that wiki, if you call it that, edited by myself, Barbara Davidson, and Kathleen Carroll. And again, what this is meant to be is a kind of slim pocketbook version of what the base science says about how to run great elementary schools.
Well, do you think that elementary school leaders in education could use more of a scientific approach in creating educational policy?
Absolutely. I mean, look, let's go to reading, where, as you know, we do have a very strong research base, have had for decades, thanks to the National Institutes of Health and lots of great studies. We know, for example, that kids need to be taught systematically how to learn to read. Kids do not learn to read naturally like we learn to speak as humans. You have to be taught. And most kids are going to need very explicit instruction in decoding the English language and phonics and phonemic awareness and the rest. And yet we see all around the country that there are still lots of schools that instead of doing that kind of approach, using the science of reading, they use something that they call balanced literacy, right? Which maybe has a little bit of phonics, but not too much. That's mostly about introducing kids to great books. Now, of course, we should introduce kids to great books. There's no argument about that. We want, I want my kids to have access to great literature, to great nonfiction books. But we also know that kids need explicit instruction in those foundational skills. We also know that as kids learn to read, if they are going to make sense of whatever they're handed, they're going to need to have a lot of vocabulary. And that vocabulary comes from learning stuff about the world, from learning history and geography and math, and art and music. And that insight, though, again, has largely gone overlooked, that instead of providing kids a lot of access to that kind of content, we say, well, we'll save social studies until third or fourth or fifth grade. We'll save science until later. We're going to focus on, quote, reading comprehension skills, even though those skills don't actually make much of a difference. What actually makes much of a difference is whether kids know about the world. So when they sound out the word Tyrannosaurus Rex, for example, a light bell goes off and they say, hey, that's a dinosaur. I know what you're talking about. And so those are the sorts of things that are in this book. So no, long answer to a very short but important question. I think there's a lot of room for growth in our elementary schools around using the research. Look, I think it's gotten better. I think that there is a more attention to this now than there used to be. I think, the state standards that most states have in place are more research-based than the old ones used to be. And I think we see an increasing number of schools using high-quality instructional materials that are aligned to those standards and aligned to the good science. But we have a long way to go. And especially given the emergency that we are facing right now with the enormous learning loss, especially in high poverty schools, especially in areas of the country that kept their schools closed for much of the 2020-21 school year. We need every elementary school to be just hitting it, just knocking it out, not knocking it out of the park. And we're not yet doing that in too many places.
Evidence-based practices is a key term that many thought leaders in education are focusing on. Mm-hmm. Michael, what transition are you seeing from previous practices to new, more evidence-based practices?
Yeah, look, this is obviously something that has been on the agenda for a long time. And, one thing is to get clear is what do we mean by the evidence? In this book, we say that we should have a high bar for what it takes to be evidence-based, but we also shouldn't be unrealistic. For example, if all we do is say, well, you have to have some kind of randomized controlled trial of your particular curriculum or approach, otherwise it's not evidence-based. Look, we think that's just too limited. That actually, what some of the most hopeful approaches involve is to take the science on, say, cognition, on learning, on reading, and then embed that science in high-quality instructional materials and curricular materials that themselves have tried very hard to be faithful to that evidence. Now, those instructional materials may be pretty new, and there are some that have come on the market in the last 5 or 10 years. They haven't been around long enough, or they don't have the huge resources to go through randomized controlled trials, at least not yet. But we can look at those materials. Smart people can review them, and they can say, okay, have they made an effort to be aligned with the research? And if so, then that is what we're looking for here. And you see that with, for example, Core Knowledge, Language Arts, ELA program, Expeditionary Learning, EL Education, Wit and Wisdom, Eureka Math, that these are programs that have been seriously about trying to align themselves to the science. And then what we can focus on is helping teachers get used to those curricular materials, helping really give them good professional learning opportunities to know it inside and out, to support one another. And so they're getting trained on the curriculum, but along the way, they're also getting trained on the evidence base. But we're not asking teachers to actually study, say, to become experts in the science of cognition and then figure out on their own how to apply that to what they should do next Tuesday with kids. That is to do that with 3 million teachers all over the country would be crazy. We wouldn't be gaining any benefit of scale. So this kind of approach works a lot better.
Is there anything that educators are struggling with within this transition?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot they're struggling with. I mean, look, when you read this book, I think people will see that we are big supporters of high quality instructional materials, high quality curriculum as the real centerpiece of improving schools. And there are better materials than there used to be. But look, we still, when people survey teachers and ask, hey, do you have access to high quality materials that are aligned to the standards in your, there's still a huge percentage of teachers, oftentimes a majority, that will still say no, they don't have access to that. And so something is happening out there where in too many districts, they are still purchasing low quality materials, and this has been a challenge forever. And I think especially in small districts that may not have a lot of staff who have the time and capacity to sift through these instructional materials, they can be heavily influenced by the for-profit publishers, which come in and, make their sales pitch, and maybe have had a relationship with these districts for a long time, and they stick with stuff that just doesn't work, or sometimes things that teachers and educators learned about in ed school, in some cases years ago, that again, just don't have a lot of evidence of effectiveness. I mean, the New York Times had a front page story just a few weeks ago from the time we're recording this podcast, Lucy Calkins at Teachers College admitting that she'd been wrong all these years about the importance of phonics. She stepped away from that a little bit in her programs, but but still not entirely. Yeah, I mean, so look, I think we still just have that basic problem. And then even in places that go and they use the high quality stuff, and they make that big decision, we need to provide tons and tons of support to teachers. Professional development, professional learning, that should all be based around these new curriculum. And we hear from teachers that that's not happening enough. So there's much work to be done. Never mind, Miss Bonnie, all the challenges related to the pandemic and the aftermath. And, we still know that schools aren't anywhere near back to normal in terms of kids coming every day and getting down and focusing on learning. And so, all of that makes it harder as well.
Well, this book asks the education community to follow the science. Mm-hmm. Do you think that education struggles to follow new scientific-based practices?
That's interesting. In some ways, I worry that the newness isn't always the problem, right? I mean, we have a field where, gosh, if we could just stick with something and stay with it for a while, right, we'd probably be better off. I mean, we are so susceptible to the new fad that comes through. It's like we have very low attention span for some reason. And so, but I think that the problem is that decisions are often made based on ideology or based on the sales pitches of the companies that are coming in trying to sell products to districts rather than on high quality evidence. And so whatever we can do to help educators see, here's high quality, here's not, here's evidence-based, here's what's not. Everybody out there, all the publishers, all the ed tech people, anybody selling stuff to schools, of course, they're all going to claim that their stuff is evidence-based. And oftentimes it's just simply not, and so I think we need to help education leaders understand what meets that standard and what does not. And that, of course, we need innovation. Of course, we need to pay attention to new studies, but we also need to pay attention to what has worked for a long time. And some of those things are very basic. I mean, we've known about the importance of phonics and phonemic awareness and the rest of the science of reading for a long time. And the barriers there was not that basic knowledge. It's been all these other things.
Yeah, that was sort of leading up to my next point was, what you think the historical circumstances possibly leading to that stopgap, this new science-based research?
Yeah. I mean, I just think we've got ideological blinders on sometimes and these other challenges. And look, of course, everybody that's worked in schools for longer than a month knows that these new ideas come sweeping in and out. And so you get an attitude that says, well, this too shall pass. Let's just wait for this to pass us by if it's something we don't agree with. I think what we need to do is find a way to create a culture in our education system that says, hey, first of all, our North Star is about kids. It's about kids learning. It's about kids' long-term success. And then if that's our North Star, how can we constantly be learning about how to get there? And yes, we're going to, if it works, we're going to know more and more over time. The science will change. That is why we have to follow it, right? That term makes sense. You follow the science because it's not static. And that goes with schools as well. But follow the science where? And for us, it's to help student learning. It's to help student outcomes. I mean, even making that the North Star is not something that I think all schools actually buy into. At least it's not what every school board in America today is focused on, right? They're focused on a whole lot of other nonsense on the far left or far right. How do we get our system to stay focused on kids and making sure they have opportunities, making sure they have opportunity to learn every day, making sure they're getting, that they're going where they need to go long term. And, in school districts and in charter school networks and in private schools that are serious about that are learning organizations, they follow the science and they get better and better every year, and that's the attitude that we need to have.
Yeah, a majority of your work centers around politics and the classroom. What can educators do to engage in these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say, this particular book, Follow the Science to School, really, we don't get into any of politics or even policy that much. It's really meant for practitioners. It's meant for principals, who are running elementary schools, district officials who oversee elementary schools. And partly that is my response to some of this, the political controversy that's going on there right now is, hey, the best thing we can do is to stick to the focus on learning, and if we can, to ignore that noise best we can, because it is noise. It is about politics. We see politicians trying to use these issues to get elected or reelected, and that's what they do, right? Meanwhile, we need to focus in our schools on helping kids learn, and especially in the aftermath of COVID. So I think that's first and foremost. Separately, look, I think educators, it's a tough time. A lot of these issues are difficult. I think they need to be as transparent with parents as possible about what they're teaching kids in the schools and why. I think they need to listen to the concerns that are out there. There have been some crazy things that schools have done in the name of various reform efforts. And, so I think they should be honest with themselves and with their parents about whether any of that stuff is happening in their schools, and if so, address it.
Do you find that many educators are willing and able to be active participants in policymaking?
There are some for sure. Look, there is a group of educators that is the most active in policymaking, and that's the teachers' unions. I'm not saying anything controversial to say that the unions are the biggest, most powerful block in education. Obviously, the unions are there to protect the interests of their members, and they engage at the local, state, and federal levels in politics because, of course, public education is inherently political. We pay for it, we oversee it through our public institutions. And there are places where, in my opinion, those unions, they just have such an outsized influence because they are well organized, because they're well funded, and look, because they're there year after year. We parents kind of come in and out of the system, but the unions are there forever. And sometimes that's not great, and then so sometimes when educators want to engage, the only way they can engage, it seems, is through the unions. And the good news is that there are a number of organizations, more and more, that have been started to help teachers find a voice that it doesn't have to go through the union. Groups like Teach Plus, Educators for Excellence. There are others throughout the country, some big and some small, but some organizations that say, hey, there are ways for teachers to be both in the classroom and policy leaders at the same time. They try to help those teachers harness their advocacy skills and give them opportunities to speak out. And that's key because, again, we do need the teacher voice. We do need to know when things are working or when they're not. I would love to hear from teachers about what's in this book, and if they find that there's certain pieces of advice that are just not realistic or that are a little bit off the mark. I know, for example, that we talk a lot about a great curriculum, EL education, in the book. And I've heard from teachers that say, look, it's a great curriculum it's just incredibly hard to implement, and it's just incredibly time consuming to prepare lessons, and it's just not realistic, on top of everything else. That's really solid, concrete feedback is the kind that we need.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your ideas with me and with our listeners. And listeners, as you can imagine, there's so much more to this. So please check out Michael's recent publication, Follow the Science to School, Evidence-Based Practices for Elementary Education, and find out more information in the show notes. And Michael, would you be willing to share some information of how people, if they like to get in touch with you and contact with you?
Sure, happy to. Mm-hmm. So my day job, I'm the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. So folks can find me there at www.fordhaminstitute.org. I'm also on Twitter at Michael Petrilli, and I'd love to hear from people.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael.
On behalf of John Catt Educational, thank you for listening to this episode of Author Chats. To access other podcasts in this series, visit edcircuit.com for a complete lineup of engaging topics. EdCircuit empowers the voices of education with hundreds of trusted contributors, changemakers, and industry-leading education innovators. This episode was produced by MindRocket Media Group. For more information, please visit mindrocketmediagroup.com to discover how you can be our next satisfied client.